It's dawn on a cold March morning in 1355, and you're riding into the village of Fobbing in Essex. You're a tax collector, a catchpole, and you've just been handed a list of peasants who haven't paid their poll tax. Your saddlebag contains wooden tally sticks, a small strong box for coins, and a letter bearing the royal seal. You have the power of the crown behind you. But the villagers ahead of you have axes, pitchforks, and 26 years of built-up rage about how men like you have been bleeding them dry. Welcome to the life of a medieval tax collector, and I'm warning you right now, this is going to shatter any romantic notions you might have about this profession. We're talking about one of the most hated, most dangerous, and most corrupt jobs in medieval Europe. A job where you could get rich beyond your wildest dreams, or end up beaten to death in a muddy road, sometimes both on the same day. Let's start with who actually collected taxes, because medieval tax collection wasn't a simple, straightforward government job. It was a wild patchwork of overlapping systems that changed depending on where you were, who was in charge, and how creative the people in power were feeling that particular year. At the top of the pyramid sat the sheriff. The shire reeve, literally the guardian of the shire, was the king's chief representative in each county. Sheriffs were typically drawn from the ranks of barons, royal administrators, and local gentry. They weren't career bureaucrats. They were wealthy men who bid for the position because it came with extraordinary opportunities for profit. Here's how it worked. Under a system called tax farming, the sheriff would pay the crown a fixed sum up front for the right to collect taxes in his county. Let's say the king demanded £500 from Yorkshire. The sheriff would pay that £500 to the royal exchequer, often borrowing the money at interest. And then he'd ride out to collect as much as he possibly could from the population. Anything he collected beyond that £500, that went straight into his own pocket. You can imagine the incentives this created. If you were Sheriff of Nottinghamshire, yes, like the Sheriff of Nottingham from the Robin Hood legends, you had every reason to squeeze every last penny from your territory. The crown got its guaranteed payment. You got to keep the surplus. And the peasants? The peasants got crushed under the weight of whatever you could extract. The sheriff didn't do all this work himself, of course. He had a small army of subordinates. There were bailiffs who supervised the 100 courts, administrative divisions within each county. There were reeves at the manor level who collected rents and taxes from individual villages. And then there were the catchpoles. The catchpoles were the foot soldiers of tax collection. The name literally means chicken catcher, the idea being that people who owed taxes were as difficult to catch as farmyard hens. These were the men who actually showed up at your door demanding payment. They were often former soldiers, minor officials, or just opportunistic locals who saw a chance to make money. They worked on commission or for a share of what they collected, which meant they had every incentive to be aggressive, creative, and utterly ruthless. A typical catchpole would arrive in a village with a list of debtors and a few armed men for protection. He'd go door to door, checking names against the tax rolls, demanding to see proof of payment. If you couldn't produce a tally stick, a notched wooden receipt showing you'd already paid, you were on the hook for the full amount. And if you claimed you couldn't pay, that's when things got interesting. The catchpole could seize your property, your plow, your ox, your grain stores, your furniture, anything of value. In theory, this property would be sold at auction and the proceeds applied to your tax debt. In practice, the catchpole and his friends often bought these goods at far below market value, resold them for profit, and pocketed the difference. Some tax collectors became money lenders, offering to loan you the cash to pay your taxes at 4% interest per month, a rate that would trap you in debt for years. Let's talk about the actual taxes you were collecting. Because medieval taxation was an absolute mess of different levies, each with its own rules and collection methods. The oldest and most important was the geld, also called danegeld. This was a land tax based on the hide, a unit of land that could theoretically support one household. Originally collected to pay off Viking raiders in the 11th century, it continued long after the Viking threat ended. The rate was typically 2 shillings per hide, but it could be higher during wartime. As a tax collector, you'd have to know exactly how many hides each landholder possessed, account for exemptions granted to monasteries or favored subjects, and extract payment in either silver coins or goods of equivalent value. Then there were the movable property taxes. Starting in the 13th century, kings began taxing personal wealth rather than just land. Every few years, tax officials would arrive in your county to conduct a valuation. They'd go through towns and villages, inventorying every household's possessions: livestock, grain, tools, cloth, furniture, everything. Then they'd calculate a tax, usually a 10th for town dwellers and a 15th for rural folk. As a tax collector, you'd have to enforce these assessments while dealing with constant accusations of bribery and favoritism. The rich would try to bribe you to undervalue their property. The poor would hide their goods or claim poverty. The customs duties were another major source. If you were a customs collector at a port, you'd be checking every ship, every cargo, every merchant. Wool exports were taxed at 6 shillings 8 pence per sack. Wine imports paid tonnage. All other goods paid poundage, a percentage of their declared value. Merchants would lie about quantities. They'd mislabel expensive goods as cheap ones. They'd try to smuggle items past you. You'd have to be part detective, part enforcer, part negotiator. And then there was the tithe, the church tax. 1/10 of every person's annual produce or income went to support the local parish church. This was technically separate from royal taxation, but as a tax collector, you often had to coordinate with church officials or even enforce ecclesiastical debts. The paperwork, or rather, the wooden work, was elaborate. Medieval tax collection ran on tally sticks, one of the most ingenious record-keeping systems ever devised. When you collected a payment, you'd take a hazel or willow stick and cut notches into it to represent the amount. A cut as wide as your palm meant 1,000 pounds. Thumb width meant 100 pounds. Little finger width meant 20 pounds. The width of a barley corn meant 1 pound. A shilling was marked with a smaller notch. Then you'd split the stick lengthwise down the middle. The larger piece, the stock, went to the taxpayer as their receipt. The smaller piece, the foil, you kept as your record. The two pieces could only match if they came from the same stick, thanks to the unique grain pattern of the wood. This made forgery nearly impossible. When you brought your collections to the exchequer, the royal treasury, the officials would match your foils with the stocks to verify every payment. The system was so effective that England used it for 700 years, until 1826. But here's what the official records don't tell you. Medieval tax collection wasn't just corrupt. It was spectacularly, creatively, systematically corrupt in ways that would make modern tax evaders blush with admiration. First, there was the basic skimming. As a tax collector, you'd receive a payment of, say, 10 shillings. You'd record it as 8 shillings on your tally stick, pocket the difference, and move on. The taxpayer got their receipt showing payment. The exchequer got their expected revenue, and you got 2 shillings richer. Multiply this by hundreds of transactions across months of collection, and you could build a fortune. Second, there was the creative assessment. When conducting property valuations, you had enormous discretion. A wealthy merchant who slipped you a bribe might see his goods valued at half their actual worth. A peasant who annoyed you might find his meager possessions assessed at double. You could demand payments in kind, grain, livestock, labor, and then value those goods at rates favorable to yourself when converting them to cash. Third, there was the protection racket. You could threaten additional audits, claim someone was behind on payments, or hint that you might report them for tax evasion unless they paid extra. Some tax collectors charged fees for accepting payment, fees for providing receipts, fees for calculating amounts owed. Medieval sources mention tax collectors who demanded meals, lodging, and gifts as the price for doing their jobs. Fourth, there was the loan sharking. Remember, you'd often paid the crown up front for your tax farming contract. That meant you had capital to lend. When peasants couldn't pay their taxes, you'd offer them loans at ruinous interest rates. They'd fall into debt cycles that could last generations. You'd accumulate their property, their labor, eventually their children's futures. Some of the wealthiest men in medieval Europe built their fortunes this way. But all this wealth came with a price, because medieval tax collectors were among the most hated people in society, and that hatred regularly exploded into violence. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 started when a tax collector arrived in Fobbing, Essex, to investigate why villagers hadn't paid their poll tax. The villagers beat him and his men and threw them out of town. When soldiers arrived to restore order, they too were attacked. Within weeks, revolts erupted across England. Tax collectors were hunted down and killed. One was nearly lynched in Scarborough. Another was beheaded in Suffolk. In London, rebels burned government buildings and destroyed every tax record they could find. At least 1,500 people died before the revolt was suppressed. This wasn't an isolated incident. In France, tax collectors were regularly beaten and sometimes killed when they pushed too hard. Peasant riots would target their homes, burn their records, and drive them from towns. In Bridgewater, in 1381, a tax collector was attacked during an uprising that spread across Somerset. The violence wasn't random rage. It was calculated revenge against specific individuals who had made themselves wealthy by extracting money from desperate people. Even when you survived the peasants, you weren't safe from your own government. Tax collectors who failed to meet their quotas could be imprisoned, fined, or stripped of their positions. Sheriffs had to appear twice a year at the exchequer to account for every penny they'd collected. The accounting process was ritualized and brutal. You'd stand before the barons of the exchequer, senior officials sitting around a large table covered with a cloth marked in squares like a checkerboard, used for calculating sums. They'd match your tally sticks against the records, question every discrepancy, and demand explanations for any shortfalls. If you couldn't account for money you were supposed to have collected, you'd have to pay it yourself. Many sheriffs went bankrupt. Some ended up in debtor's prison. Under King John, one of England's most ruthless monarchs, one sheriff raised extra money by kidnapping the mistresses of clergy and ransoming them back to their lovers. John found this hilarious and rewarded him with a gift of £1,000. That tells you something about the moral universe medieval tax collectors operated in. And then there were the tax collectors who paid the ultimate price for their profession. In medieval Spain, Jewish tax collectors were particularly vulnerable. They were often appointed because Jewish education included mathematics, making them skilled at calculations. But this made them perfect scapegoats. When taxes became unpopular, Christian populations would blame the Jewish collectors rather than the Christian kings who'd imposed the levies. Samuel Halevi Abulafia, tax collector to the King of Castile in the 14th century, was arrested and executed. Legend claims he was skinned alive, though historians debate the details. What's undeniable is that being a Jewish tax collector in Christian Europe was signing your own death warrant. The daily reality of being a tax collector meant living with constant anxiety. You traveled rural roads carrying strong boxes of coins. You rode into hostile villages where everyone knew your face and hated what you represented. You slept in inns where poisoning wasn't uncommon. You dealt with forgery, counterfeiting, false claims, and endless attempts to cheat the system. You also dealt with genuine tragedy. Not everyone who couldn't pay taxes was hiding wealth. Medieval life was brutal. Crop failures, disease, war, and famine regularly devastated communities. As a tax collector, you'd encounter families who literally had nothing left. You'd have to decide whether to seize their last ox, which would prevent them from plowing next year's crop, or let them slide and risk being accused of corruption yourself. The system created no room for mercy. Some tax collectors developed reputations for fairness. The sources mention officials who tried to balance the crown's demands with local economic realities. But the structural incentives pushed toward exploitation. When your income depended on collecting as much as possible, when your peers were getting rich through creative enforcement, when peasants already hated you regardless of how you behaved, why not take advantage? By the late medieval period, the system was clearly failing. The peasants' revolt had shown that there were limits to how much you could extract before people rose up. Kings began reforming tax collection, replacing tax farming with salaried officials, introducing oversight mechanisms, creating written records that were harder to falsify. But these reforms came slowly. In England, sheriffs maintained their tax collecting role into the 16th century. Tax farming continued in France until the French Revolution. The tally stick system lasted until 1826. Why does this matter? Because the medieval tax collector embodied a fundamental tension in government that still exists today. States need revenue to function. Someone has to collect that revenue. But the people doing the collecting have their own interests, their own incentives to abuse power, their own human failings. The medieval system magnified these problems by making tax collection a profit-seeking enterprise rather than a public service. The legacy lived on in other ways too. The medieval sheriff became the template for law enforcement officials across the English-speaking world. The accounting methods developed at the Exchequer influenced modern bookkeeping. The concept of tax farming, privatizing collection, reappeared in various forms throughout history and continues today in modified versions. And the hatred of tax collectors? That's remained remarkably consistent across 8 centuries. Medieval peasants who saw catchpoles as parasites bleeding them dry would recognize modern complaints about the tax system. The methods changed. The tally sticks became paper forms, became digital files. But the basic dynamic, government needs money, someone has to collect it, nobody wants to pay it, and the collectors get blamed for the whole mess. That's eternal. So, the next time you complain about filing your taxes, remember the medieval tax collector. Remember that you're not getting beaten in the street. Remember that your tax collector isn't keeping whatever they can skim off the top. Remember that you have legal recourse, written laws, and a system that's at least theoretically designed to be fair. Because 800 years ago, the men doing this job rode out knowing they were hated, knowing the system was rigged, knowing they might not make it home. They collected anyway. They got rich when they could, they died when they couldn't, and they laid the foundation for every tax system that followed. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what life was really like for medieval tax collectors, smash that like button and subscribe for more analytical approaches to history. What other medieval professions would you like to see covered? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.